investing in getting things right early will make a huge difference downstream. The more successful you are, the less time you have to do those things. So at the beginning, you have more time because you don't have customers and so forth.
In my time in the military, you have to follow specific procedures and regulations to get things done. And a startup's different because you don't have all the resources of the federal government backing you. You have to move quickly. So you can't inundate yourself with bureaucracy and additional process, but it is important to follow specific important steps so that you achieve the result that you want.
Anthony, Austin, welcome to Tech Scenes Unplugged.
Thanks so much. We're happy to be here.
Great to be here.
Awesome. Well, I have not had two people on the episode at the same time, and I'm really excited to do this. I think it's going to be fun. There's going to be some issues from time to time, who's talking when, and I think that's going to be the fun part. I like to start from the top every single time on the episode, and so we're going to dive into your backgrounds. But before we do that, let's just start from the top and tell me about Vali Cyber. And I'll have Anthony start.
Okay, well, Vali Cyber is a cybersecurity startup. We're focused on protecting hypervisors and more specifically Broadcom VMware. That is a very popular hypervisor, and it's we have the only solution in the world today that is capable of actually providing runtime protection for those systems.
And how did this come about? I'm guessing it is a combination of both your backgrounds, but I believe, Austin, you were working on some of this stuff.
Yeah, that's right. So prior to starting Vali Cyber, I was in the U.S. Air Force. I was responsible for the security of satellites, with satellites in orbit, satellite ground systems. And as part of that, we were really doing a lot of defensive Linux security. So I was protecting Linux systems from various types of attacks. We tried to take different commercially available tools and apply them to these systems to protect them. We ran into a whole bunch of issues. And so Vali Cyber started about 5-6 years ago as a Linux security company. Then as we grew, we focused on this area of hypervisors because there's really no one else doing anything to protect hypervisors. And we've seen a huge influx of attacks over the past few years. So there's definitely a problem that needs to be solved.
And for people that don't know much about this space, what are hypervisors, and maybe explain it in a way that a high school student can understand what you guys are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So a hypervisor is a fancy word, but basically it's a computer whose job it is to run other computers on top of it. And so the reason why it's such an attractive target for bad guys is they recognize instead of going after these 60 or 100 systems, I can just go after this one. If I go after this one, I'll be able to get money out of the company from a Bitcoin payment or something from a ransomware attack.
And who are you guys targeting? Who's the companies and organizations that you're targeting for what you guys are building?
A lot of financial services, public sector, DoD, and healthcare, the usual suspects of organizations that need enhanced security. But we've worked across all the different verticals. We have customers in many different verticals, although those are the particular ones that we tend to focus on. Interesting.
What do most people not understand about this industry and about what you guys are building? What's some of the common misunderstandings?
There's a lot of people that don't understand the extent of the risk that they have. And part of that is due to the fact that these systems have largely been ignored up until about 2022. And then as the threat actors and nation state actors have become aware that this was effectively an unprotected attack surface, those attacks have started to grow, and more recently, they're exploding. I read an article just recently that over 10% of the ransomware samples that are being developed by threat actors out there are specifically targeting the VMware environment. So, that's an indication of how significant an opportunity the threat actors see those systems as.
Looking at this and there's just such a huge market, right? Like this market is huge that you guys are going after. Like, what's the beachhead and what's the way to get into this market, and what are you guys seeing? Versus, you can't go after everybody all at the same time, right? So what's
That's
the
it. Focus, focus, focus. There are something like, I don't know, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 cybersecurity companies worldwide.
right?
It's it's just an enormous number. And so, given that degree of competition, if you're not focused on something very specific, you're just never going to have an opportunity. And I really have to credit Austin and some feedback that we received from customer advisory board that we had that basically suggested we look at hypervisors and VMware in particular as a place to focus. And as we investigated that, we found that it was really, there was no competition. We are the first provider of security for that area. Now, competition will surely come, but we will make as much hay as possible, as quickly as possible, while we don't have that competition.
Right. And now your background is, well, both of you, Air Force background, am I correct?
That is correct.
And then Anthony, then you've been an entrepreneur, multi-time entrepreneur.
Yeah, this is my fourth company. I've been doing startups for a long time now, lived through, the dot-com bubble and everything subsequent to that. And Austin is my co-founder and son. So we kind of have a unique opportunity here to marry his technical background together with my business experience to build something which I think could be a very significant company.
And then the last company that you had, did you sell that or did you wind it down before you decided to come into?
So all the companies I've been involved with were acquired. Sort of my philosophy is, build a sustainable business, particularly around differentiated technology. And ultimately, what's happened for me anyways is interested acquirers have approached us about buying the company because they saw that we were, generating market share and generating positive cash flow. And, they wanted to own the technology effectively. So I think that's a similar philosophy that we're taking here. It's build a successful business. That is the core. And in doing so, we have a very strong mission focus on helping companies. Ransomware is often overlooked in terms of the pain that's created. People hear about, $35 billion worth of cost or something like that. What it means, though, is people losing jobs and income. Particularly smaller companies, it is an existential threat that if they get ransomed, that those companies are not able to survive that. And the owners of those companies go bankrupt, and that is a terrible process. So anything that we can do to help alleviate that pain, we've got to sleep feeling good at night.
The horrible thing about ransomware is the impact it can have on healthcare organizations. You see this a lot with attacks against hospitals. A few months ago, there was an article that came out and it documented some of the first cases of people actually dying because they didn't get the care that they need because the hospital had been disrupted by a ransomware attack. And so it's not a direct attack against someone's physical health, like if you made their Tesla drive into a bridge or drive off a bridge or something like that. But it does have these indirect effects that can cause significant physical harm and even death. So it's just a terrible, terrible problem. It's something that is worth solving.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What companies or types of companies have you guys been working with, and what have you seen kind of some of the results that you're getting out of the product that you guys created?
So kind of as Austin said, we're pretty agnostic in terms of companies that we work with. We've got customers in pretty much every vertical. Where we see the greatest demand is with organizations that are highly regulated. Those organizations tend to spend more disproportionately on cybersecurity than others, and they're more aware of the risk as well. So they understand the value proposition that we provide. Interestingly, while Austin said we started the company in 2020, sort of in the middle of COVID, we spent probably 9 months building a prototype to really prove to ourselves technical feasibility. And during that period, we didn't actually spend any money. It was all sweat equity. We built a prototype, proved it was able to work. And at that point, we had a small group of investors that had put some money in. They said, we all agreed we should move forward and start spending some money. So we actually hired our first person second quarter of Q2 of 21. And it took us, about two and a half years to build a product. We ended up getting a number of DoD contracts to help fund the development. So that was a good thing. And so we've only really been in market really since, for a year and a half about.
Right.
And what's remarkable is just in the last 6 months, the number of attacks that we've seen against companies that we're engaged with, initially we didn't see anything, and then it's increasing at an increasing rate. So, we're definitely in the right place at the right time, not for happy reasons, but we're glad that we can help, protect these companies.
Right. I'm real curious. I grew up in an entrepreneurial family. So, I was in a family business. All my uncles owned businesses. I always, grew up in this kind of entrepreneurial world myself. And I'm curious, Austin, with your dad's military background and this entrepreneurial background, did you always assume that you were going to go into the Air Force and that maybe you'd start a business someday? Or what was it like growing up, and what was kind of your mindset of what you thought you'd be doing?
Well, I certainly saw my father's work ethic, and I think that's something that inspired me to do hard things. And so I remember high school football practice, 2 days, tough things growing up and just pushing through adversity. And I knew I wanted to spend some time in the military just to get some initial experience as I started my career serving the country. I think the Air Force Academy and the service academies are a great way to do it. I had a wonderful experience there. I learned a ton. And I really did not expect to start a company. I think this is just something that came out of, this idea that I had based on my time in the Air Force and the pain that I was feeling. And it was really good timing too, because it was just at the same time that Anthony had sold his previous company. And so he was, either going to retire or find something else to do. And so this is where we really got together and we came up with this idea to build better protection for Linux systems and ultimately hypervisors.
It's so cool. Yeah, I think, and Anthony, I want to hear from you on this too. Like, what was the thought process going behind when you started thinking about actually doing a business with your son? Because it can be complicated, right? It can be challenging, right? Like, and, being a father myself and having kids and love getting into my kids' projects and trying to help and support them. And also having a dad that was entrepreneurial. Did you think about it a lot before you made the decision, or did it just happen? Or did it feel like it wasn't a decision, it was just something you had to do?
It was definitely kind of just happen. I think it was a confluence of events. The fact that I was finishing up selling my previous company, COVID had hit, and so you really couldn't do anything. And I grew up in an entrepreneurial family too. So, it was a family business. I would go work, Saturdays and Sundays and all summertime, in my mom and dad's business. And so when Austin approached me, it never even thought about, well, I'm going to be working with my son. It was more about, is there really a market opportunity here that I focused on? And that's why, I think we started talking about it around January or something like that of 2020, maybe February. And then we didn't start the company until, beginning of Q3. So it's about 6 months, we basically batted the idea around and focused really on how do we verify that there's a real opportunity here. And we were fortunate in that Austin was connected with the former CFO of SentinelOne. He was a very valuable person to talk to in terms of the market and the opportunity. And we got introduced to some senior partners at McKinsey that were in the cybersecurity practice. And it just so happened that they had been engaged with a large European company that had been hacked. And, when we were talking about Linux, that was the way that these hackers got into this big company. And they're like, yeah, it's definitely a problem. You guys should go after it. So that was really, from a market point of view, that was the validation we needed to actually, form the Delaware Corporation, get some folks to put some, and the money came basically from former angel investors that had worked with me in the past. So wasn't a difficult thing for us to get them initial capital together.
Right.
But we wanted to make sure we were going to actually have a reasonable probability of success. There's always a chance. You're not going to be successful when you start up a company, but we wanted to try to, be on the as high probability of success as we could realistically get to.
Right. And Austin, what were you thinking at the time when you had? I feel like maybe it's similar than my feeling is. Every time I've started a company, it doesn't feel like a conscious choice. I just see a problem that I can't stop thinking about and coming up with solutions to solve it. And next thing I know, I've started a company. I mean, it sounded like you came with this challenge and solution, and you're probably talking to your dad about it. And it went back and forth. And he's like, I want to support you and figure this out together. And is that how it came about for you, or what was it like?
That's a pretty good explanation. I remember the initial conversations we had about it were on the family beach trip. And so it was literally around the kitchen table that we were talking about this idea of starting this company. I just remember being so excited as the company started, excited to really do something that's based on my own ideas, my own beliefs, and do something that I thought was meaningful and impactful that would be good for the world. And I think that's something that's permeated the ethos for the company as we've grown, is that we want to do well by doing good. So we want to become a successful company by doing something that's good for society, that's legitimately helpful. And so we hold ourselves to a super high standard when it comes to product quality, when it comes to our ability to really stop these attacks, because we genuinely do want to stop these attacks and help people. And so I just remember being so excited at the ability to craft that company culture from the ground up.
I want to dig into something, and it's a topic that I think is really important. I wrote about it in my book, Peak Teams. I really believe that at any stage of any company, the better organized you are, the better off you are. I mean, they literally call organizations because they're organized, right? But you often hear startups are so chaos and we're just doing whatever we can in every direction. But I really believe the best ones are often the most organized. They spend time to pause, think, plan, execute, iterate, change, communicate, all the things that you need to do to really get yourself where you want to be. And I'm curious about having a military background and learning those systems and that diligence and that consistency on the military side, if that has changed how you feel like you actually work and actually how you're building this organization.
I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, in my time in the military, you have to follow specific procedures and regulations to get things done. And a startup's different because you don't have all the resources of the federal government backing you. You have to move quickly. So you can't inundate yourself with bureaucracy and additional process, but it is important to follow specific important steps so that you achieve the result that you want. So I can think about this in our financial modeling, our financial planning, that guides our hiring. And I can also think about it in the way we write code. We have a very rigorous code review process. We have unit tests that we have to run through. We have procedures and checklists for committing new code to the product. So we're definitely process oriented, but not to a fault. I think you can definitely go too far with it and it can slow you down. We want to focus on the really important things and put process around that, but allow people the ability to take risks and to really push things, because that's ultimately what you're doing in a startup. You're taking a lot of risk. You're trying to push the frontier of where we are today.
And I think teams mess this up in that they over process in the beginning or under process later. And I really think you have to figure out the right system and how much system you need at each stage as you scale. I think people underestimate what they should be doing in the earlier stages sometimes. And then when they start to feel these pains, it's probably because of that. And then it can also flip the other direction as well. But Anthony, I know that you have a lot of war stories of going through different stages. What was something that you had seen before in one of your earlier startups where, you kind of hit a wall?
Well, I think that, yes, you make a great point that investing in getting things right early will make a huge difference downstream, because the more successful you are, the busier you are, the less time you have to do those things. So at the beginning, you have more time because you don't have customers and so forth. The one element I think that is complementary to that question of trade-off between process and speed is communication. And communication is really important. And that's one of the benefits I find in a father-son team. Kind of the bandwidth of communication that we have is unusually high. He knows me so intimately and vice versa. We say a few words and all of a sudden the other person understands the intent, and all of a sudden we short-circuited to a conclusion. So
right.
That's the one benefit I see that we have here that I've not experienced elsewhere. I also think that the experience I've had to date in the multifaceted go-to-market approach, that the different companies we had, were focused a little bit different. We were very direct sales focus in my first company. In my second company, we had a lot more channel focus. We were kind of had some OEM relationships in my third company, and with this company, we're having understood and experienced those differences and the benefits and challenges. We're taking a multifaceted approach. We have a direct sales team. We are developing channel with a particular focus on OEM partners. And so far, it looks like it's working well. And the beautiful thing about that is you distribute your risk, because the way I look at a startup, it's all about managing risk. Risk is inherent in a startup. And if you can manage risk effectively, you are going to get to an outcome that's going to be beneficial, for the team and for the investors. And so by having a multifaceted go-to-marate and revenue generation engine, you minimize that risk, or at least alleviate it to some extent, because you have different, channels providing different sources of revenue.
Right. Can you think of a time where maybe that you didn't manage risk appropriately, or where maybe you got burnt, where that lesson is a strong core belief of yours now?
100%. So the first company I was in, I was the VP of engineering, and I was focused on product, and I was focused on building product, and we built a great product, and all of a sudden we're out of money. The CEO just failed to make sure we had enough money in the bank. And so what happened? Well, the board said, "Thank you very much, CEO. Anthony, will you help us out here? And we need you to go raise money now." So that was kind of my first experience of, there are multiple facets to a company. You can't just focus on one. And
right.
Money is a really important focus. If you don't have enough money, nothing else matters. So ever since then, I have paid a lot of attention to runway and making sure that we had, enough money in the bank to get to that next point where we could raise more money.
That's interesting. When I work with teams and we do planning, if we're looking at the 3-year vision or the 1-year plan, I like to break it up functionally and look at each functional area of the business. Obviously, like in a software company, you'd have probably sales, marketing, product, engineering, maybe ops, customer success. But one functional area that I always make teams make is corporate and capital development. And that's, I believe, is the role of the CEO, and the function of the CEO is to build the organization and then make sure you have the capital to see the vision through. Because I've also seen that in some of the teams that I've worked with in the past too, where they kind of forget or didn't put enough emphasis, even in their planning, of how much time it actually takes to raise capital sometimes. And
100%.
Sometimes it can go really fast, and sometimes it takes longer, right? And sometimes, or oftentimes, probably every time, you don't know. And you actually really have to plan that out, right? So,
and there's the macroeconomic environment too. It's like you might be doing really well as a company, and all of a sudden 2008 comes along, and it doesn't matter how good you're doing. There's just there's not a lot of capital to be had. It's just, and so it's definitely a challenge to because it, as you say, how long it's going to take is critical, because that's what that's how you're managing a runway. And if all of a sudden the external circumstances change and what you thought was going to take 6 months is going to take you 12 months, then all of a sudden you got to do some radical things. How are you going to cut your spending in order to be able to make that time frame?
Right. Austin, what's been kind of the biggest lesson learned for you, or kind of a flip in mindset since you started this? I mean, this is your first startup, and did you have some initial beliefs coming into this and ideas that maybe are different now that you're in it, doing it?
It's definitely a marathon and not a sprint. I remember being super excited, and I still am super excited about the company, but you have to recognize that things take time. You have to have some patience behind building the business, getting customers. I remember getting started, we'd have our first initial customer conversations with some big companies. I'm like, yes, this is awesome. We're going to land a deal next month. It's like, no, that's not how enterprise sales works. Like, it's going to take a long time to land a deal. You have a lot of stakeholders you have to talk to, a lot of people you have to get buy-in from. There are a bunch of different things that can go off the rails. Not only does the product have to work, but there has to be budget. The legal review of the contract has to go through appropriately. So just understanding that patience and how long things really do take was something that was new for me, and dealing with a lot of failure. I mean, prior to starting this company, I was really, in school a lot of the time, and I was in the Air Force. And so I was doing very well in all those things. I had experienced a lot of challenges and repeated failure, but you do that all the time in a startup. And it's not a bad thing to fail in a startup. You're going to have accounts that you don't win. You're going to have conversations with prospects that didn't go the way you wanted them to go. But the key thing is to learn from that and to keep getting better over time, and to stay persistent. Don't let it get you down if something isn't going your way. Just understand what went wrong and what you can do better in the future. I think we've done an excellent job of that at Vali Cyber. It's part of the reason why we focused on hypervisors. I mean, hypervisors is such an interesting market, and we were being driven there by feedback from our customers. So you have to listen to those around you. Even if you have this great idea and you have a lot of experience behind you, make sure you're taking in feedback from the market, from the people that you're talking to.
Yeah. I think learning loops is everything in growth companies. And you can say startups, any place that you want to grow, I think you really have to learn, digest that learning, and then execute again, learn, think about it again. I think that learning loop is super important in all companies, because you can even think about from day one when you just have a hypothesis, you go out and test that in a lot of different ways, right? For the product, or even sales, right? Like you go out and test like how you're going to demo something, or maybe the contract's new, or your sales process is new, or everything that I think people do in a new company or when a company's growing is always testing things. And what I see where a lot of companies kind of fail is they're testing things, but they're not having that communication, that learning loop back into the company. And when that doesn't happen, it's just wasted learning, and they tend to not really learn from it and then do it better. And I think people, what I find when you're building companies, I think one of the most important things when you're looking for people at early stages or in any sort of growth stage are looking for people that are very interested in learning. Because I think people that are interested in learning are interested in or being willing to change, right? If you're not willing to change, you're not willing to learn. And I think in the environment of growth, you always have to be learning, because things change and are new every single day. And a lot of the stuff, especially like what you guys are doing, or a lot of the people that I work with, are doing things that have never been done before. There's no blueprint for Vali Cyber. There's no blueprint for Vali Cyber. Anthony, how do you, I mean, you've done this multiple times. Do you have some sort of framework for like planning, or some sort of like cadence that you do around like kind of organizing the team and getting those learning loops to happen?
I wish I had a more, I guess, scientific approach. I haven't really had the time to distill all my learnings and put it into a form that I could actually systematize the process a little bit more. There are lots of things that I've learned. I've learned that really good financial model is critical, and it's critical for a number of factors. It is a mechanism for capturing learnings, and the learnings that you can capture there are things like, sales cycle time, average deal size. And if you're paying attention to the details as you're constantly refreshing this model, you've actually captured it in an executable form that you can begin to see, what does this mean in terms of my runway? And as you get more information, then you start getting predictability into the model, and you can start projecting, what does this mean? Oh, if I borrow, $3 million of venture capital or venture debt, I can do this. I can, grow my ARR by $5 million. That's, $50 million of additional, pre-money valuation. There's all kinds of what ifs you can start doing if you've got that in place. But if you don't start early, it's really, you ultimately have to go through that process eventually. But the more data that you can have in it, the stronger you are, and the more value it has, downstream.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be kind of the key thing I think I've learned.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I talk about this with the teams I work with all the time. And most of the teams I work with are, from 25 employees to about 500 employees, all in the growth stage. You'd be surprised how many teams, mid-sized teams, that are not tracking their data. They're not setting goals. And sometimes they're like, well, we just don't know, so we don't want to set a target. And my belief is set a target, know that you don't know if the target's right. But at least when you set a target, you'll start measuring those things, and as you measure that, then you start to learn your business. And I think without measuring anything, you're not going to learn your business if you don't ever, start putting targets out there. And then when you put those targets out there, if you don't want to, get your team upset, you let them know what that target means. That target could be like, we have to hit that number, or that'd be amazing if we hit that number. Right. But at least have some sort of context when you set goals, and then also know that by setting them, you're going to start measuring things. And that measurement's probably the biggest value piece you can do, because data doesn't lie. If you understand what the data means, and you can start to, as you do that, you'll get better at figuring out what that number is going to be in the future, or if that's maybe not even one that you need to measure, and maybe it's something else you need to measure. But I think that's a kind of iteration learning loop as well. It's like, what do we measure? What do we not measure? But I always tell teams, the best time to start measuring something is right now. It's not tomorrow. It's like planting a tree, right? We should start measuring that right now. I think metrics are so important. I think that's a great lesson learned. It's a great lesson learned. Now, Anthony, you taught entrepreneurship, I believe, right?
I did teach entrepreneurship at UVA for several years to engineers specifically. Well, that's interesting. And what were the topics that you taught? Well, boy, all kinds of different things. One of the most important things was, you have to really think about who you want to talk to when you're looking to raise money. You talk to a later stage investor and you put some numbers up in front of them, and you're a new company and have no background whatsoever. Those are swags, best, right? They're just pulled out of nowhere. And an early stage investor is going to recognize that. They're going to say, yeah, okay, I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to that. I'm going to look at the team and the product ideas. A later stage investor is going to look at that and say, okay, these guys are going to generate some significant revenue in a short period of time. They might invest in you. And all of a sudden, you miss your numbers completely, and they're upset. But they shouldn't be, just because they don't have the right expectations set. Another really important thing young people sort of expect is that the more somebody's going to give you, the more they value your company, the better. That is not necessarily true. As I experienced in my first company, when we ran out of money, what happened? Well, when we raised second round of money, it was at a lower valuation. So the anti-dilution clauses come into play, and everybody's basically starting from scratch. That is something you want to avoid. Not necessarily at all costs, but to the extent that you can manage that, you don't want to have a down round. And that means be cautious about how much you raise, and at what valuation. And then, the last thing would be taxes. At the end of the day, you're going to have a successful outcome. Taxes matter. And nobody knows about, 1202 or 1048, unless they've been an entrepreneur and paid attention to those things. So a young person, starting a company, having that knowledge is going to have a big impact in terms of how they think about the future and, the form that they want to take their equity in, right? It's like if you want to start your holding period, that's going to impact what you want. You don't want options. You prefer to have restricted shares, for example.
I think that's really important. I actually I graduated with an entrepreneurship degree back in '98. It was a very new degree back then. There's a lot of schools now that teach entrepreneurship, and actually my high school offered some entrepreneurship classes too, which
that's pretty cool.
I mean, entrepreneurship classes to me were the easiest classes ever. It was so interesting to me. I didn't ever felt like I ever had to study. I just showed up and hung out. But I think it's so important. I think there's so many things that entrepreneurs can learn. I think there's so many more resources out there now than there were ever before. And, I obviously got obsessed with it. I have basically created an operating system for high growth companies that I wrote about and that I help teams with. But I think there's just so much low hanging fruit. And that's part of the reason why I love doing this show is that, I think if people tune in and listen to things, they can just shortcut. You don't have to learn everything the hard way because you're going to learn a lot of things the hard way anyways, but you don't have to learn everything the hard way. I think it's just great that there's people out there teaching entrepreneurship, sharing lessons learned, war stories. I think it's really important. Well, before I sum this up, I do want to get to a couple of other things. One, Austin, I'd love to hear from you from a product perspective. What's Vali look like in the next 12 to 18 months? And why I'm asking you specifically, because I feel this in a lot of entrepreneurs is you're excited, but trying to be patient, right? Like you probably have already designed like 2 years out in what you want to build, but you can't build it all just today. So I'm curious, what's the next 12 to 18 months look like? And then how do you, in times of trying to be patient, how do you get through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So regarding the next 12 to 18 months, I think there are a couple really key capabilities we're going to be adding to the product. So one of them is the ability to do better insider threat protection. So anytime somebody runs an operation on a system that we're monitoring and it's a sensitive operation, you have to do multi-factor authentication. And that's typically not the case on a lot of computer systems. You only do MFA when you log in. But what if you did MFA anytime something sensitive happens? So I'm really excited about that capability. We're looking at including LLM technology into our product, but in a smart way, in a way that will allow us to take information that's out there, synthesize it, and then use that information to immediately deliver value to our customers in the forms of security rules and additional capabilities to the product that allow them to stop recent threats. The idea is using LLMs to be super fast and super automated and responding to the most recent threats. And then I think another really cool capability is just focusing the company on more things besides VMware ESXi. Anthony talked about how our focus right now is on this specific system, but in the next 12 to 18 months, we're definitely going to expand beyond that, focusing on other types of hypervisors, other types of Linux systems as well. So expanding our market of the types of systems we protect is going to be a very important thing that we're going to be doing here over the next 12 to 18 months. And then learning patience. I think learning patience is tough. It's still something I have to deal with all the time. I get impatient about things. There's a deal that's right on the edge and it's right on the edge for a few weeks. Like, why isn't this thing closed yet? The last stakeholder hasn't gotten the signature, or that the CIO or the CISO is out on vacation. And so I think practice makes perfect. You learn patience by being patient. And so something that you can do is, if you're kind of bugging out about something or you're really focused on something, try to divert your attention to something else. Breathing exercises can help too if you're really stressed out about something. So I think all those sorts of mental techniques and mental gymnastics that you can do to just divert your attention to a different thing that's also important, that can allow you to be a lot more patient rather than being so laser focused on one thing and why isn't it happening now.
Awesome. All right. I have one final question for you guys. And I usually do this in a different way because I usually only have one person on the show, but I'm going to change it. Now, first, I just want to let you know, this is probably one of the most important questions you've ever been asked. And you guys are easily answered all these other questions. So I'm glad you're sitting down. This is going to be a tough one. And it's more of a scenario. And this is the scenario. The scenario is you're trapped on a desert island the rest of your life. You got water, food, shelter. You got everything you possibly need. And it's a beautiful desert island. Apparently, you're trapped there together, both of you. But there's one thing that's missing, and that's entertainment. There is absolutely no entertainment on the island at all. But luckily for you guys, old 80s boombox drifts ashore with unlimited batteries, but you can only bring one album. It has to be an album of any era. It could be just came out yesterday, or it could have been the 80s, whatever. You only can bring one album to listen to the rest of your life. What are you going to bring? And we'll start with Anthony. And then we're going to go to Austin. And this is going to be the change that I've never done this before. Then I'm going to make you guys agree on one album.
All right.
So that's a tough one. That's a really tough one. I would say probably Reckoning by the Grateful Dead.
Ooh.
Yeah,
I like that.
For me, it's got to be one of Kid Cudi's albums, probably Day and Night by Kid Cudi. But I think one that we could both agree on would be Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust by David Bowie. I think that's a great album.
I would agree to that one.
Yeah.
See, you guys proved how well you work together right there. Look at that. Agreement. You have one album the rest of your life, and you just quickly like, oh, I'll agree to that one.
There you go.
Awesome.
There you go.
Those are all good answers, by the way. I think those are all good answers. I could live with all three of those. All right. So the final answer was, what was the album?
Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust by David Bowie.
Well, thank you guys for being on the show. It was fun to have you guys on today, and I appreciate your time.
All right, Jeff. It was a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you, and we appreciate you having us.